Great, thank you.
Great. Next slide, please. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to be covering a couple of topics here. One is both related to integrated distribution planning, as we've discussed, and in particular around how modernization and resilience really are conjoined as Commissioner described. So I'll first talk about how we think about modernization and then do a deeper dive on the resilience dimensions as we look at this. At the outset, what you're going to hear from myself and Fritz as well is that it's really important to start with a structured approach to thinking about how to modernize the grid, the distribution grid in particular, as we're discussing today. And that starts with really understanding what is needed. That is, what are the principles that yourselves and other policy objectives have laid out for what the grid needs to be able to support? And then from that, pretty clear objectives around what the design of the system, what is needed in terms of the functionality and capabilities on the system as it gets built out over time. And those incremental investments, those system requirements that drive the technology choices that ultimately are identified in investment plans and the like. So we use this taxonomy we referred to in multiple levels, starting with the what and then getting into the how. Next slide, please. Now, as part of the DSPX effort or the modern grid report that we developed over the past few years, we translated that into a process that lays out like as illustrated on this slide. That is really two parts. The first part being strategy. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? With some initial understanding of the functionalities and capabilities and a conceptual view out over time. Typically this can be 5 to 10 years, but taking a longer term view to provide that more holistic look at not only the near term needs, but how that then relates to where a state or individual utility is seeing changes in customer needs and trends on DER adoption or resilience or electrification, how that's evolving over time. So really looking at strategy to sort of paint that picture, again, driven off of clear objectives and policy and customer needs. That then flows into an implementation, which tends to be in the 3 to 5 year horizon, where there's specific funding requests that may be derived and presented to a commission. And so that's this two-part process, and recognizing in this process that you can have these things happening simultaneously. So you can have, obviously, as is often the case, you'll have requests in front of you for funding related to grid modernization, but at the same time, there may be a desire to have a longer term view so that there's some context under which the near term request for funding fits into this broader picture. Next slide, please. Now, as we look at objectives, which is the second level there around what, as part of the DSPX effort that we developed, we identified a common set of typical objectives that are often identified in many states and certainly in a number of utilities. It's not to say that all of these would necessarily be appropriate, but it just gives you a sense of a range of different types of objectives that may align to your own interests in your particular state. But one of the things that's quite helpful when we think about objectives is to have pretty clear direction that you can provide to utilities to think about what's required in terms of their planning for investments on the grid that link to the physical, power system analysis that they do from their distribution system as they look at the changes to the grid that you talked about in the first session. So that's what the objective here is to really identify in clear terms what you're trying to accomplish in those sets of objectives that apply. Next slide, please. Those objectives then are translated into a set of capabilities, and in general terms, it sort of sets out into three categories of objectives: those that relate to safety and operational efficiency, those that relate to reliability and resilience, and those that relate to DER integration and utilization. We think about these broad buckets only in the context of being able to help sort of organize our thinking around the specific capabilities. What this chart is showing is that in many cases, traditionally, the kinds of distribution investments that we have thought about in the past largely fell where the black dots are. And obviously in reliability and resilience, we've had very traditional kinds of investments related to, say, hardening or some other dimensions. But there are some newer techniques and technologies that are coming into play, and those sort of represented by the other blue half. But when we think about grid modernization, often we're talking about, how the role of distributed resources might help participate and provide some services to the grid. That's what's represented by market operations or their participation in the wholesale market. But as you can see, certainly, distributed energy resource integration and electrification as well really do drive a lot of the new needs as we think about operations and planning. Next slide, please. So just as an example, and obviously we're kind of quick on time today, but just to give you one example of a taxonomy to think about how you would apply an objective like reliability that then derives from improving the reduction in customer unplanned outage durations. That is, how do we reduce customer exposure to outages? And say there's an objective as part of that. There's a need to achieve second quartile performance related to customer average interruptions, and there's a date that may be given that performance is to be achieved. The capability obviously would then to be one capability might be improving outage identification and customer service restoration. The functions then start to identify multiple functions that may be related to achieving that capability. That could be improving fault identification, fault location, then isolating the fault, and then service restoration. There's a number of technologies then that might then enable those functions. So fault current indicators, outage notification from smart meters, outage management system, a geospatial information system or GIS, how a distribution management system or advanced distribution management system and or SCADA controls automated switches in the field to help with the restoration or isolation, and work management system that comes into play as part of managing the outage response workflow. So these are all potential technologies that may relate. In some cases, these technologies already exist, and then there may be enhancements where additional technologies may build upon existing capabilities to be able to support these functions. But this gives you an idea around how these relate to each other in this taxonomy. It's also a way to really have clarity around why a technology is necessary to meet a certain objective. So this provides a traceability, a clear line of sight from a clear objective and then associated capabilities and functions to specific technologies, so that it's clearer, why something is needed and what the potential benefit is. Next slide, please. The other concept that we've introduced as part of the modern distribution grid effort, the DSPX effort, was this idea of how to think about the various investments that may be proposed in grid modernization, which have a lot of technology, software systems, but also field automation and control systems that are involved as well. So how do we think about these different dimensions? And we've developed this approach, leveraging platform concepts that are, that we see everyday life in other industry sectors. And the same thing applies here when we think about modern technologies. So in this case, what we're looking at is core technologies that really provide the foundation that we think about in terms of the physical grid infrastructure, and then the operating systems that sit on top of that, like an ADMS, like an outage management system, and the like, that help operate that grid fundamentally. And then on top of that are applications that a utility will have in terms of managing the system or providing customer benefit. And then there are others, third parties that will have applications that will also benefit from that core infrastructure, as Commissioner talked about in her opening remarks. So, for example, if we're thinking about DER services, those DER services that are provided by, let's say non-wires alternative, those services basically, essentially sit on top of other applications and functions that that the utility would have. And to be clear, an operating system might be a distributed energy resource management system, a DERMS, or a demand response management system that they may already have. That gives you a sense of an operational system that sort of supports, and that's referred to here as a market operational system, but that supports that ability of those DER to provide those services for the grid. Underneath that DER would be things like an distribution management system and other control systems that are interfacing with the physical grid. So these layers of technologies are part of what comes, we think about as we look at grid modernization. Next slide, please. This is a deeper dive into what this might look like. What we've noted on this slide are what we believe are the core components, those things below the line. These are elements that are required no matter what you're trying to accomplish, above the line in terms of specific applications to support customer choice, to support the integration of distributed resources, to support things like, smart EV charging and the like. So how do we think about the core components that are necessary to operate this grid and create that platform that enables all these other applications to function appropriately and to create value, both to achieve customer objectives as well as public policy objectives. So that's what's identified here. This framework, what we often refer to as a technology stack, has proven quite helpful for folks to kind of get a sense of the range of technologies, how they fit together in this layering approach, one on top of another. Also, as we recommended folks to take a look at, it's also useful sometimes in a summary form to be able to look at what's your current state of development related to these technologies. So, for example, people shade these boxes as a percentage of how much they may be complete in terms of their modernization efforts. So that's another use of this technology stack. In our documentation, we have detailed definitions for each of these technologies and the categories that they represent, as well as in our volume 2, we also have a maturity curve associated with where the current state of these technologies are and subsets of technologies within these categories in terms of their relative maturity, in terms of adoption. Next slide, please. This gives an example of what I was just referring to. This one comes from Hawaiian Electric in 2017, but many utilities across the country have been increasingly using this as a way to communicate, where they are in progress. Where there is no box just indicates that they haven't actually started to pursue that technology yet. And the shaded boxes give you, the progress in terms of their relative adoption of newer technologies to accomplish their objectives. Next slide, please. Another way to look at grid modernization in the bigger picture is to also look at the rest of the distribution investments. Obviously, this is a consideration for many commissions, is understanding the total expenditure that utilities are investing in distribution systems and understanding where those technologies lie to have that sort of full picture as you're considering the grid mod component. Here, what this is representing is that there's essentially this pyramid, so that each of these layers of technology or investment categories in the distribution system build one on top of the other, and that as we think about things like microgrid, advanced microgrid capabilities, think about higher levels of distributed energy resource integration and utilization, those things really build upon the fundamentals underneath. So having advanced, sensing, protection, and control systems, having some basic distribution automation that underpins that, and then of course having a robust distribution system that has the flexibility inherently built into its architecture to be able to support the kind of capabilities we're talking about above. And certainly as we think about more sophisticated topologies on the distribution systems related to how we might think about the integration of microgrids. So all of these build upon each other. And this slide's also highlighting that often how a utility may think about or conduct its analysis for what it needs, there are generally sort of three categories. One is the grid modernization dimension, another might be around reliability and resilience, and a third is around asset planning. And often these have been done by three different groups within a utility. And increasingly, as we talk about integrated distribution planning, the direction is to really think about these holistically within the utility. Certainly commissions have an interest in doing that so that you see the total picture in terms of how these relate to each other. Next slide, please. So this is an example of how a longer term plan can start to help provide some context for a nearer term proposed investments. This comes from Xcel Energy's 2019 Integrated Distribution Plan, which is a pretty good example of applying the concepts that we've been talking about as part of the DSPX effort for several years. And this is just an illustration, but increasingly a number of utilities and certainly commissions in pursuing integrated distribution planning and looking at grid modernization with sort of this two-prong approach. One is understanding where the utility may be thinking strategically over a longer time horizon. 10 years is fairly common. In this case, they went further than that. And then with nearer term plans that align to that then ultimately can be adjusted over time as forecasts for customer adoption or policy changes occur. This sort of two-prong approach is reflected here, and that is sort of a leading practice now as a way to for you all to have a better sense of where this may lead to, and getting a better sense of what the cost might be over time. Next slide, please. So in terms of considerations for any grid mod effort, are those objectives, have they been established in policy or regulation or proposed by utilities? So are there clear objectives? Is there a clear starting point for modernization? One of the things we really advocated early on is establishing where your starting point is. That chart that showed kind of progress, that was to really kind of give a very thumbnail look at current state. Obviously, there needs to be a much more detailed articulation of that, but it's really important to understand your reference point for modernization, and then also where you want to go in terms of your objectives, and really the difference, the gap, becomes the point at which you start to develop your strategy and implementation planning efforts. It's also important to really consider the pace and scope of change that's required over the planning horizon. And does the grid mod plan address the needs? And to the extent that there's a fair amount of uncertainty, is there flexibility built into the grid mod plan to address those potential changes, either to accelerate or to slow down, as the case may be? And then are the plans, as we talked about, aligned and integrated with asset management and resilience planning, so that there's a solid, holistic, well thought out investment plan? And then, as I said, is there enough flexibility to deal with changes, both in terms of the rate of change that's needed from a customer policy standpoint, but the other thing that comes in often is this consideration about changes in grid technologies. As we've seen pretty consistently over the past decade or more, technology advances, particularly in grid technologies, has been advancing pretty quickly. And so there's opportunities to take advantage of new technologies. Certainly, as we think about a 10-year horizon, it's quite conceivable to have at least one generation or possibly two new generations of technologies are related to grid that could be incorporated. And so understanding what flexibility may arise out of that and how to think about adoption of technologies in the time horizon, given that many of these investments, particularly those that are implemented in the field, may have a 20 or 40-year life expectancy. So what's the technology strategy that's being considered in that plan. Next slide, please. So these are a set of resources. Joe Palladino's our contact at the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. There's a whole set of resources here. For those of you who have interest in going a little deeper or have some follow-on questions, certainly in the office hours, I can point you there. Or if there are any follow-on questions through email, I'm happy to respond to those. So maybe we move on to the resilience, and I'll try and move that quickly because I know we're only got a bit of time. We're going to, next slide, please. Next slide. So we're going to dig deeper here on resilience. I don't have to explain to all of you, what's happening around the country in terms of the increasing severity. As I, do work around the country and I look at state emergency services offices and the like, it's clear that the projections are for increasing severity of events, and particularly those events that can have fairly catastrophic, either at a local level or even at a regional level on distribution systems in particular, as we're talking about today, sometimes at the transmission, but a lot of the brunt of these events tends to be on the distribution side in a disproportionate way. So obviously there's a consideration increasingly on the need to think about resilience at the distribution system, and that goes hand in hand with modernization. You can't divorce the two, so it needs to really be considered as part of the modernization effort. Next slide, please. So as we talk about, we usually in GridMod talk about these three domains, as I mentioned before, and certainly here we're going to talk about the reliability and resilience dimensions. Next slide, please. One of the things we want to take into account when we think about distribution resilience planning is obviously the relationship between electricity and other critical infrastructure in the community. There's many more than this. Obviously, this was developed some time ago to kind of look at more holistically the relationship between some. But as many states, I'm sure many of you are looking at other critical facilities as we think about hospitals, we think about police and fire, we think about even going into grocery stores and banks and other what's becoming clear for longer duration outages that we think about. There may be multi-day events. What are the other societal sort of infrastructure that we take for granted day to day that really become quite critical as we think about moving forward in a system that's a community that's much more dependent on electricity as we think about electrification. Next slide, please. So as we think about the planning process for resilience, there's kind of three domains. One is the planning cycle. The other is the operational cycle when an event is happening. And then there's usually a post-event evaluation that feeds back into the planning process. We're going to talk a bit about objectives and criteria, the integrated planning dimension, how you think about solutions, and then solution prioritization. But it's important to understand, that all these elements relate, but for the purpose of today, we're going to focus on the planning side. Next slide, please. So as we think about resilience threats, there's some nice work that came out of Hawaii that's publicly available. There was a working group put together that was really led by the community. So state officials, city and county officials. In the case of Hawaii, the Department of Defense has obviously a lot of facilities there, and so they played a strong role. But all the other sort of critical facilities that you can imagine, were represented, and others as well. And through that process, they developed the first thing they did was they took a look at, what are the various threats that could create pretty significant issues for Hawaii. Obviously, hurricanes are quite prominent. Tsunamis are an issue, flooding, and you can go down the list here in terms of potential issues. So one of the things that the group did was they took a look at these and they ranked them based on what they thought the impact would be for that community. And so this is something that they developed, the working group itself came up with. The other thing they did, which is not represented here, is they also identified and ranked in terms of priority the critical facilities. So which type of facilities in Hawaii were the ones that they wanted to make sure were prioritized in terms of any major event. And those two components are pretty important because, based off of that, you can start to then identify more specifically what the needs are for investing in the distribution system to make it more resilient in the event of one of these catastrophic occurrences. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things as we think about this, and that report, by the way, is online and available. There's a lot of good information in it. One of the things we think about with outage duration is that certainly over time, as has been seen repeatedly over the last decade or so, starting with Superstorm Sandy in the back east, and increasingly as we've seen events on the west, that the economic and social impact of long duration outages really has this exponential effect in terms of impact. And when we think about reliability events, those things that generally last less than 24 hours and pretty localized, where you may have a car pole accident or wire down, or even something a little larger than that, where maybe a substation outage. Those kind of reliability events, they do have an impact, but it's not anywhere near when we get into multi-day events, and certainly when you start to have the scale of that event extend more broadly over a particular community and or region and the like. So one of the things that we need to think about when we think about resilience threats is what's the scale and scope of the event, and what's the likely impact over time in terms of what we need to do in terms of response. Next slide, please. So one of the techniques that's used after you identify the threat analysis is to then, as I was mentioning, is then to look at specific vulnerabilities on the grid, and then start to look at solutions to prevent that specific failure. That's on the left side of this, what's called the Bowtie diagram. And this is about how to prevent an outage. So, are there solutions that can prevent that outage? And hardening is one of the techniques that people look at, but there are other techniques that can be done as well. Then you may not, always be able to prevent a specific failure, a transformer failure, let's say a substation transformer failure. So in the event of that failure, what are the potential mitigating solutions that you might have to be able to address that potential event? And obviously you're not going to spend more than what might make sense in terms of risk tolerance, but this comes into place where you're looking at both the potential to avoid the issue in the first place, and then to the extent that it did happen, what's your backup plan in terms of mitigating that event. This Bowtie analysis, type analysis, is increasingly a best practice to think about how to address these larger events. It's also a technique used for reliability analysis as well, but particularly as we think about resilience events, this becomes much more prominent. This is something that is used in California related to the wildfire mitigation plan. Embedded in that methodology is a Bowtie analysis that's used. But this is being used in other places around the country as well. Next slide, please.
I think we have a poll question now.
Thanks.
What is the level of maturity of threat and risk-based assessments for utility distribution resilience planning in your state? Just a reminder, enter your questions, please, at any time in the chat box. You can ask me, Carrie, or you can put it in the chat box for everyone, and I'll moderate questions at the end of both presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So just to highlight, what I was showing earlier with the pyramid and where the overlapping investments and planning are. This diagram is illustrative of pretty typical distribution budget allocation for capital, and as is color coded here, the blue shaded areas all have elements that relate to resilience, capability, and reliability. There's a lot of overlap in terms of what may be needed. That includes even things like customer service requests, because the design standards around how customer service and service connections are made also can have some implications for resilience. And certainly information technology has its own resilience planning dimensions that are related to it and are critical for supporting a number of these operating systems. So it's important to understand the relationship between these two, as well as the grid modernization and other distribution investment. Next slide, please. So this just reiterates what I was describing before and building on that diagram, that it's really important to understand the interrelationship between all of these elements. And one of the things that's quite helpful to think about when you see a grid modernization plan is to really understand how they're linking any modernization investment specifically to any resilience objectives that you have in your particular state around the specific threats that have been identified. Next slide, please. One of the other things, this is a little busy, but one of the things we're trying to help folks think about is that when we think about resilience, it isn't just necessarily the utilities, solution that's going to solve it. It's going to be a range of potential solutions. So you can have individual customer solutions, you could have an individual critical facilities solution, you could have something that addresses multiple critical facilities, you could have critical facilities and essential services that include, say, banking and gas stations, and then you're going to have community scale. Often these point solutions tend to be not utility oriented, investments, whereas the community-based solutions tend to be a little bit more utility on the utility side, although they can be, larger microgrid development. But the question is going to be, how do you balance the needs of these with those customers that may have backup power in the event of a disaster or a major outage, or are we going to try and address a larger community? And this gets pretty complicated. It's kind of an emerging area of research and development that's going on in many of the discussions in states that are trying to tackle these issues. I know, just because I'm in California and active on these topics in California, this is certainly an issue that's coming up in the discussions around microgrids and the like, and related to the broader grid investments that go on. So this is an area that could certainly benefit from additional research and the work of some folks out of Sandia that have been applying some interesting techniques along the lines of what we've been discussing here to help think through and work through these issues. Next slide. So as we talked about at the outset, you're going to have different scale events, and at each level of scale, there are other folks that may get involved in understanding and participating in the planning. So if we're at a local event, that's largely within your domain and down to the local level, including the utilities and other solution providers and local governments and the like. If we're starting to talk about more significant localized events, then it may involve more of the governor and legislature, if the scale is that of significance. And then as we get into regional, where we get into multi-state type events, then we start to get, or even impacting the transmission system, which may be the case, then we start to get into other agencies and entities getting involved in the planning process. So there's definitely multi levels of discussion and planning that go on around these different types of events. Next slide. Thanks. This again just highlights the different roles that might be that folks might play in this process as we think about these different types of events and kind of these roles and responsibilities. And of course, there's a stakeholder process that's quite important to this as well. Next slide, please. And this just highlights some examples of that, similar to what I was just talking about earlier in terms of the resilience working group. Next slide, please. And the Michigan statewide energy assessment was a really good report looking at specifically these issues around reliability and resilience. And I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's one of the better ones I've seen in the country. Next slide, please. And then for considerations, how are potential threats being assessed and translated into planning considerations or planning objectives? Is there a clear and logical explanation of how a proposed investment, by a utility directly or indirectly supports a resiliency? This also comes up in the case of third-party development of microgrids. How do they fit the overall public policy and objectives, both for all customers as well as those customers that may be within the bounds of that microgrid? Is there sufficient transparency in the planning process to really understand how resiliency is being addressed and reflected in investment plans? And as we talked about before, how are we thinking about the mix of potential solutions, those that are customers and the point solutions, and those that might be related to the grid and community scale? So how are these linked together? And how are key stakeholders involved in that process to really sort through and identify what the most effective set of solutions are? And it may involve stakeholders that haven't typically been part of a distribution planning process. It may involve reaching out to organizations that may not have really had clear engagement in the past on these topics. Next slide, please. That's it. Thank you. There are some